Hello, I'm Brett Knowles, and this is what we've called the Controller's Risk Primer. What I'm going to do is quickly outline some of the interesting and key concepts about risk and how we measure risk to overlay what you already know as a controller. So as a reminder, risk management is just about an ongoing process to identify, analyze, and evaluate, as well as treat the loss exposures around risk. Enterprise risk management is just expanding that to take a look at anything that prevents the organization from achieving its objectives. So I think there are 10 things that are interesting and unique about risk that are important to understand as a controller. And in no particular order, they are understanding the likelihood and impact conversation, the risk bow tie, about good and bad risks, about the types of risks we have in our organizations, the core elements of a risk event, figuring out what your organizational risks are, risk measurement itself, and the overlap between risk measurement and performance measurement, the role of strategy in considering your risks, and then finally, choosing your risk mitigation approach. So, let's start. The risk, likelihood, and impact conversation. So simply put, when we take a look at risks, we look at it in terms of the likelihood of that risk occurring and also the impact of that risk. Now, in fact, we can put these on a chart as the X and Y axis. And so if we think of a risk that has a high likelihood of occurring and a high impact, this is something that's quite critical. And obviously the opposite, low likelihood, low impact, we don't need to pay as much attention to. So we can take a look at any risk and consider its likelihood and impact. So, for example, if I have something significant like a new product I'm launching fails, that may, if we're not good at it, have a high likelihood and also have a high impact. So that's sort of red, something that we need to really pay attention to. The next band, let's say the product launch process itself. Maybe I put that into yellow or amber, where there's a moderately high likelihood and a moderately high impact. And then there's the rest of your risks, which are, for example, not hiring the right person. So the idea is we can take any risk and scale it on likelihood and impact and be able to visually represent and understand what are the risks that we need to pay most attention to and where do you need to focus our risk mitigation activities and so forth. So, interesting tool, easy enough to do even in a small business. You could put a blank sheet of layout of this on your whiteboard, use some post-it notes, and quickly identify across your leadership team what risks you have where, and have a debate about where they actually lie. The risk bow tie. What I think is interesting about the risk bow tie, and it's called a bow tie because it looks like a bow tie. On the left side we have what you can do to avoid the risk happening. Then, of course, you have the risk event, and then what you can do to recover from it. So to avoid it, there's a bunch of things you can do. Prevention, protection, and preparedness. And once the risk has occurred, there's a bunch of things you can do to recover. So mitigate the damage, respond to it, and recover from it. So if we take a look at a simple event, let's take a non-business example, a car accident. There's a bunch of things you can do to avoid a car accident. I can make sure I don't drive in high-risk areas. I can put in better brake systems, better wheels, all sorts of devices to avoid the likelihood of us having an accident. But every once in a while, it's going to happen. So what can we do to recover from it or to reduce the impact? Now, to reduce the impact of the accident, no pun intended, we can do things like seat belts, airbags, crumple zones on the car, and so forth. Other parts of the impact of that, of course, are the financial impact, so I can reduce that by buying insurance. So the bow tie talks about things I can do to avoid the risk and things I can do to lessen the impact of the risk. And in some cases, it's cheaper to recover from it than to avoid it. In other cases, it's the opposite. So this is an interesting equation to look at for each risk that you deal with. Third, the idea that some risks are good, some are bad, some are both. So if we take a look at a risk, some I have the opportunity of gaining and losing. Think of introducing a new product into a market. There's and those are typically what we call speculative risks. In other words, you're taking a chance, you've got an upside and a downside. So the hazard risks, though, only have a downside. So let's say, for example, your company is pumping polluted water into a local stream. As an extreme example, there's only one thing that can happen. It's a risk. And so you're just hoping perhaps you don't get discovered, or there's no cost involved. Another thing would be, for example, data security. So the idea is, if we take a look at it in the context of your business, those speculative risks typically are owned by management. They're decisions we make about entering markets, new products, new manufacturing lines, and so forth. Hazard risks tend to live at the operational level. They tend to be spat out from these speculative risks and are owned lower in the organization. So the idea is these two different types of risks exist at different places in the organization, and to understand them, we have to actually interview at both levels. Next, core elements of a risk event. I think this is fascinating. The idea is that for risk to happen, there's some sort of action, then there's a condition in which the action occurs, and that leads to some sort of uncertain consequences. And overall, that's within a context. Now, that's the risk definition. Let's begin swapping that out for the business world. So let's say, for example, you're a part of a bank and you're thinking about entering online banking. So the context is that market for online banking. The action are the range of things you could do. I can go in the market immediately. I can run some tests. I can take a look at what competitors have done, stuff like that. Conditions are the conditions of the environment. Potential risks of people stealing your ATM, what the competitor is doing to steal your market, who the potential customers are to use it, and so forth. And then, of course, what are the gains or losses for the company? So in the business world, let's change those words a bit. Instead of context, that becomes your mission or strategy. The action, I'm going to call a trigger. There's trigger events. And those trigger events are playing off particular vulnerabilities. So, for example, a vulnerability might be your firewall's down. That doesn't mean the risk is occurring, but you're just vulnerable. The trigger event is someone hacking your system or trying to hack your system. So if both things are happening, my firewall is down and someone tries to attack, then I have unfortunate consequences. But I need both these things to occur, both the vulnerability and the trigger event. And that to me is fascinating because it leads us to some decisions that we have in the organization. Most importantly, it gives us two control points. I can control the trigger, so I can make it so that people cannot try to attack my system. Vulnerabilities, I can put up those firewalls, and I can put up controls around the impacts. So again, think of controls as things that limit it, like your seatbelt and airbag controls the loss of an impact. So the controls are eliminating that target event. So for example, if I'm concerned about someone getting onto our company keyboards, I shut the system down after every 5 minutes of inactivity. I make sure I've got pass keys so you can't even access the premises. Those are controls at the trigger event. At the vulnerability, I'm going to reduce the ability to, the firewalls and so forth. Now, in some cases, we call the trigger and vulnerability combined the threat or the threat level, which is a combination of that overlap between trigger and vulnerabilities. Okay, next. How do you figure out what your risks are? Now, the problem is this. Many organizations, traditionally, they just interview people. And I think that our research validates that there's a bunch of weaknesses with doing that. Not the least of which is recency. I remember the risks that occurred this week, last week, more than last month, or the quarter before, or the year before. Secondly, bias. If I think that the risk is under control, I'm not going to rate that risk as high. But I could be wrong about it being under control. Or ability to see it. I could interview someone who is in a position that doesn't understand, say, reputational risk, and therefore isn't going to present that. There's an issue of not evilness, but people want to manipulate the system where I might be under or overscoring a risk based on some personal bias I have about the business. So interview process, I think, doesn't work as well as it might. So what we recommend doing is taking what we call a risk breakdown structure. So for example, in COSO, if you work hard enough, you can sort of extract this framework. COSO describes as 4 major categories of risk: operational, customer, environmental, and financial. And then within those, it breaks them down. So for example, in financial, I can have risk associated with cost, with financing, external financial events like interest rates, and financial risks. So now what I can do is interview the board of directors, the executive leadership team, operational leadership within these areas. And now I stop and think and go, okay, so what are the regulatory risks, which might not have come up if I didn't have this sort of tickler list? Now, this is a generic one called COSO. If you just Google risk breakdown structures, you'll find a gazillion of them. There's different risk frameworks themselves, such as ISO 31000. There's more comprehensive risk frameworks, and there are industry-specific risk frameworks. So typically what we recommend you doing is get a starting point and then extract really cool ideas from the other ones to come up with your own unique checklist. Risk measurement. Now, risk measurement isn't really all that different than performance measurement that we've had before. So, but there are some sort of unique parts to it. So thing number one is, if we take a look at a particular risk, what I might want to do is measure how fast it's growing. So again, back to car examples, the speed of onset of a car accident is, seconds. But the speed of onset of losing that car to, say, rust could take years. So same risk, the car is worthless, but different speed of onsets, and therefore, as I take a look at that as a leadership team, I'm going to consider it differently and consider the risk mitigation differently. Secondly, we have to measure the risk itself, what is called a KRI, which is what information we can get about whether that risk is occurring. So say, for example, I'm concerned about the quality of the software, the risk of bad software I've issued. I can take a look at the number of helpline calls, number of complaints, number of returns, repeat business, a whole bunch of indicators that are indicative about whether that risk is occurring or not. Now, when risks occur, we put a fence around it. We call those things controls. Again, my example before was seat belts and airbags. So I can measure the effectiveness of those controls. So in the example of the airbag, it's really effective. Why? Well, you notice when you start up your car, the airbag light lights up on your dashboard. If the airbag will not charge, the car will not start. So that control works 100% of the time. No airbag, no motion, no car. The seat belt is maybe a 4 or 3 out of 5 because it works really well when you put it on, but you don't have to put it on. You can drive without it on and just tolerate the dinging for a while until it goes away. So we should be able to have auditors come in and take a look at the controls, see if they're in the right place, the right time, and effective to measure the control. Then finally, risks are pretty clever. They often occur in places where they didn't occur before. So I need to measure the overall system, what some organizations call KPIs, key performance or key process indicators. And what we're trying to do is take a look at the total system to see if something unusual is happening. So let's say, for example, I see absenteeism suddenly increasing. It doesn't tell me what the risk element is. Is it the location's in a bad neighborhood, that the pay is wrong, the boss is wrong, the products are wrong? There's some sort of risk event has gone on that's causing the system to perform differently, but I don't know what caused it. And so I have to come in with some diagnostic equipment. But we recommend looking at overall systems indicators as well. In other words, as you build a risk scorecard, we should see if the risk is occurring, measure the speed of onset, measure the effectiveness of controls, and take non-predictive measures. So in total, we have that holistic view. Now, the overlap with the performance measurement is kind of interesting because we are measuring the same thing. And in some cases, it's even the same indicator, but we give it a different name. So in the risk world, if we take a look at your performance over time, there's a certain level of performance we expect. And then there's sort of this upper and lower threshold, which is if everything perfectly happened, how well could you perform? And if every problem in the world happened, how bad would things be? In the risk world, we call that the risk universe. Now, same current performance, slightly above and slightly below that are what I call my risk tolerance levels. In other words, if I go beyond this, I'm really going to get nervous. And then finally, there's what we call the risk appetite, the area that this is within expected, I'm okay with it. So literally, we could put colors on it. Green, risk appetite, everything's fine. Yellow, we're slightly off performance, higher risk or lower risk than we would like. But you should be able to solve it with the resources we've given you. So focus on it, but it's just an amber. And then finally red. Red is send help. Red is, I can't solve this problem with the resources you've given me. I either need more budget, more people, different strategies, somehow or the other, but we're in the trouble zone. So these are the risk words that we use. Now, these concepts, though, aren't different than what we had in the old performance measurement world. We'd call this one our target performance. This would be our performance threshold. Same thing. If I'm in that range, I just have to focus to fix it. And there's my crisis, right? When the indicator turns red, leadership needs to get involved. So same principles, basically the same targets, but different wording. Next, the role of strategy in considering your risks. So, take a look at this simple example. What if we listed your strategic goals of your business down the left and across the top the known risk elements? So we've got enter new markets, develop new products, make our customers happy, whatever those strategic goals are, and risk elements, market penetration risks, government risks, and so forth. And if we scored them, maybe risk 1 has this footprint and risk 2 has this. So the question is, which is the bigger risk? Well, based on this, we might suggest that because there's 3, elements that this risk touches, it's the bigger risk. But in truth, strategy is about prioritizing our activities. And if, getting those new products out is our key strategy for this year, we might now hypothesize that risk 2 is the bigger risk because it touches a 50%er and a 20%er. So it touches 70% of our strategy, whereas this one only touches 50%. So if we build this out, we can score all of our risks and quickly identify which ones are the biggest risks for the company. So in this example, risk 7 touches 50, 70, 80% of our strategy. So risk 7 has the potential of being the biggest risk. Now, why this is interesting is we need a way to take a look at all those risks which are occurring and get alignment about which ones are most critical. Like, we understand there's a relationship between risk and reward. So now we need to understand, is this risk worth taking? What's the reward associated with it? Now, we can, instead of putting the risk elements across the top, what if we put your core processes? Because the idea is, guess what? Each of your processes also impacts those strategies. So if I use that same, what we call an ontology framework, we can quantify which process is the most important process. So in this case, guess what? Shipping would be the most important process. So now when we try to take a look at my risk mitigation strategy, we have an interesting table. So back to this table, let's say we're now concerned about risks of being late on a shipment. And let's say we need 4 weeks lead time to solve that problem. Well, if I take a look at leading indicators, if it takes me 4 weeks between when I build it and when I ship it, then waiting till I start building it's too late. By the time I start building it, the risk has already occurred. But if I take a look at a different process, let's say when we get the final design approval from the customer, if I had some risk mitigation here, that gives me 5 weeks of lead time. Remember I said I needed 4. So this may be an easy one to monitor, and the cost of doing that is fairly low. Let's go another step in the process. Let's take a look at catching it at order entry. Now, the benefit of order entry is I get 6 weeks of lead time, way more time to mitigate my risk, but maybe the cost to capture this is quite high. So once I understand where my risk is, and then the lead time I need for my risk mitigation strategy, I can then begin to figure out where I'm going to begin putting down some key risk indicators to give myself enough lead time to make effective decisions. So again, I think there are 10 interesting things that manifest risk differently than how we measure traditional performance. But other than that, it really fits into what you already know as a controller. Now, I outlined before quickly what the process was verbally. Let me just show it to you. The idea is we need two key things to start with. Your agreement on what the company's strategy is, and then secondly, those risk categories, that risk breakdown structure we talked about. And if we combine those together, the senior team should be able to give you an assessment of risk by those big categories. We then take those big categories to the operational group, and they're going to do that specific risk analysis to come up with the risk register. And then finally, we need to build that scorecard to measure it. So the strategy, right? I'm a balanced scorecard guy. That's going to take a look at sort of a strategy map that tells us our strategic goals and their priorities. We're going to use that risk breakdown structure and work with the board, the senior team, and senior leadership to score each of these strategic goals against these categories of risks. You can see the colors match. And I can now quantify where my big risk areas are. We're then going to take these to the operational team and specifically, again, using the same goals, but now take a look at each of these risks and break those out in terms of impact and likelihood to see the true risk register. And from those, we can create that new scatter diagram. But now we also know, based on where these dark colors are, where I need to invest in having specific risk indicators where I take a look at the impact, likelihood, speed of onset, and be able to make decisions about where we need to manage risk. So I hope this has been interesting to you. It's been a quick overview of the interesting things about measuring risks as seen by the controllers.